unbelievably hyperproductive people are. It's just beyond belief. I mean, Nikola Tesla, who invented alternating current, that actually turns out to be a big deal, invented the electric motor and the electric generator, among endless other inventions. He said that whole inventions would pop into his mind in one burst, right down to the angle of the screws, or the screws that held the mechanisms together. And sometimes he would invent things so quickly that he couldn't get one written down before another would pop into his head and obliterate the previous one. And Mozart as well claimed, and Mozart was a little more understandable because he was unbelievably highly trained by his father as well as being a prodigy. But he said whole symphonies would pop into his head at once, and it was just a matter of writing it down. And so creative achievement is really something, and it's not like we understand it, but it's rare, and the people who are really good at it are prolific beyond belief, And so when you hear about the 1% having all the money, you think, well, that's a side effect of some pathological system. It's like, no. Don't get oversimplified about this. It's a big problem. Now, anyway, so this old guy, he explained to me part of the reasons that the Pareto distribution emerged, say with regards to the money. And so it's complicated, and this is why Walter Scheidel's book is also extremely useful. I mean, one of the things that seems to happen is that IQ has nonlinear effects. So, and you can imagine why that might be, because if you're the first person to get somewhere, then, except if you're creative, but if you're the first person to get somewhere, then you're more likely to benefit disproportionately from getting there, because you're the first person. And so, if you have a high IQ, then you're faster than everyone else. And then if you align that also with the fact that you're going to network with other high IQ people, which is exactly what's happening in Silicon Valley, for example, then that starts to become exponentially more worthwhile. And that's the thing, too, is that this is also associated with the Pareto distribution. There's another kind of iron law of economics, which is a very sad law. They call it the Matthew principle, often, which is an allusion, oddly enough, to a New Testament statement. And the New Testament statement is, to those who have everything, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, everything will be taken. And that's sort of aligned with another New Testament statement, which is, the poor will be with us always. I think, well, those are pretty strange statements for what purports to be an ethical document. But I think what they do is to point to something that's very, very deep about the way that wealth is both generated and distributed. And so there's nonlinear advantages to, say, having a higher IQ. There's potentially nonlinear advantages to having higher rates of conscientiousness. There's potentially nonlinear effects to being a creative thinker. But then once you start being successful, like you might think you start being successful and then it's a linear trend upwards. Or you start failing and it's a linear trend downwards. But it doesn't look like it graphs that way. It looks like as you start being successful, each success makes the next success more probable. So it looks like this. And as you fail, each failure makes the next failure more probable. So it looks like this. So there's scaling up on one side, rapid, and there's falling off a cliff on the other side, equally rapid. And so that's the Matthew principle, and those things operating together seem to produce this Pareto distribution. And the problem with the Pareto distribution, as Marx pointed out 120 years ago, he thought it was attributable to capitalism, is that capital, say, tends to accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer individuals. Now, Marx was right about that, but Pareto had already figured that out. I think Pareto predated Marx, although I'm not absolutely certain of that. I'm hoping that it's true anyways. But Marx wasn't pessimistic enough, and modern-day left-wingers aren't pessimistic enough either, because, of course, what drives politics on the left is the observations of inequality and the potentially catastrophic effects of inequality, and there are potentially catastrophic effects of inequality. That's the thing. That's also well documented. So if you're a good social scientist, you should know something about the Pareto distribution. You need to know something about the fact that creative achievement is a nonlinear process, so is success. You should know something about the fact that IQ predicts lifetime performance, as does conscientiousness, although not nearly as well. And that there's this proclivity for success to cascade and for failure to cascade. But you should also know that And I think this is credible evidence that as inequality increases, as it seems to do inexorably, societies themselves destabilize. So I mentioned earlier the two correlations that I know of that are very large. One is IQ predicting life success, and the other is Margaret Wilson and Martin Daly, at McMaster University. These are the first people who discovered this. It was shocking research when I first came upon it because I'd never seen anything that was this powerful in the social sciences. So they were interested in what drives male homicide. And I had studied aggression in males. Well, males are more aggressive than females. And I'll talk about that in a little while. It's not a huge difference, by the way. So if you took a random woman and a random man out of the population, and you had to bet on who was more aggressive, and you bet on the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. So there's a huge amount of overlap between men and women with regards to aggression. And this is another thing you might want to understand. It's really important to understand this, is that two groups can be very similar with walloping differences at the tails. So here's an example. So let's say the overlap between men and women is substantial with regards to aggression. But let's say we don't care about aggression except when we're talking about the person who's the most aggressive out of 100. And you can imagine that would be the case because you don't really care if someone's aggressive as long as they don't come into your house with a gun. Right? They can be pretty damn aggressive, but when they cross that line into outright aggressive criminality, then they've hit a threshold, and that threshold essentially means incarceration. So you might say, well, what proportion of men are the most aggressive people? And the answer to that is something like 9 out of 10. It depends on how you slice it, obviously. But the more aggressive the slice, the higher the proportion of men. And that's why 9 out of 10 people in prison are men, even though on average men and women don't differ that much in aggression. And so it's really important as well, and this should be taught, sort of basic statistics, somewhat sophisticated I would say, but that kind of statistics needs to be taught to people in junior high and high school because otherwise you can't understand easily the way the world works. You can't understand how men and women can be mostly the same, but they can still be really different at the extremes, and a lot of activity occurs at the extremes. You know, we're trying to pull everyone's talents into the general marketplace, let's say, for lack of a better word. And there's some real utility in that. It seems stupid to not use the talents of half the population. And I guess that's kind of what we decided with the invention of reliable birth control. It was sort of a collective decision that if we could free women from the inevitability of non-stop maternity, that might be a net benefit to everyone. Now, whether or not that is true, we don't know because the experiment's only been running for 40 years. But you might think, well, it was the experiment worth running. And then the sexual revolution and all of that, we're still in the throes of that, is a consequence, as far as I'm concerned, of the introduction of the birth control pill, because that's a biological revolution of, you know, I think the 20th century will be remembered for the hydrogen bomb, the microprocessor, and the birth control pill. Those are the three big technological revolutions. The question is, well, how should men and women act towards each other in the workplace? And the answer to that is, well, we don't exactly know. We don't exactly know what the rules are. We don't know how to regulate our sexual behavior in the workplace. I think it has, these are deep ethical questions, like the ethical question of what you're doing when you go to a nightclub. You think, well, that's not a deep ethical question. It's like, yeah, it is. It's pretty much as deep as they get, actually. Because you're asking, well, how should I regulate my sexual behavior when I have choice in the matter? And it's the same thing in the workplace. I mean, this is, in most situations like this, I'm a traditionalist because I actually think that the best solution to the problem to the multiple problems that life throws at you is stable monogamy. I think the evidence for that is overwhelming. Now, exactly how you parameterize that and what leeway you allow people within that framework, well, you know, I'm not wise enough to know. I think you deviate from that path at your peril, and that we deviate from that path as a society at our peril as well. And so, I would say, if you're looking for a cheap thrill, and you think that you can find that in sex, that you're sadly mistaken. That's what it looks like to me. How about you don't do anything physically with anyone that you wouldn't talk to them about first? I don't mean active consent. I think that whole idea is a fabrication of like delusional 13-year-old girls. Well, because life is a lot more subtle than that, obviously. But I do think that a good rule is something like no physical intimacy without a corresponding emotional intimacy. And I think the reason for that is because you just can't fractionate people. Like, we come as a package. And I think that you fractionate off your functions, let's say, at your psychological peril. So, now that's a pretty vague answer, unfortunately. Well, but it's also an all-encompassing question, right? So you're going to get a vague answer to an all-encompassing question. I mean, I also wrote a little bit about that at the end of 12 Rules for Life, when I'm talking about the archetypal representations of human beings. In the Christian domain, the archetypal representation of a woman is a virgin with child. And the archetypal representation of a man is a crucified hero. And those are actually pretty decent representations of it. They're overwhelmingly powerful. And you know that because they would have lasted like several thousand years without having overwhelming power. Well, the crucifixion image is an image of the voluntary acceptance of suffering and death and the possibility that's transcendence. And the Virgin Mother is something like the pristine totality of the feminine and the feminine in conjunction with the infant. And those are holy images. And then I would say that if you're not treating each other like you're a manifestation of that holy image, then you're not treating each other properly. You might say, well, that's a pretty high, what do you call it? That's an extreme demand. It's like, well, that's okay. Life makes extreme demands. Life is nothing but one extreme demand over another. The reason that those archetypal images exist is because they reflect a reality that can't be transcended. Something like that. And so you violate them at your peril.